Evening came to Hogwarts slowly, like a blanket drawn over someone already half asleep. The last gold of day rested on the highest windows, then softened, then thinned, until the old stone seemed to settle into a gentler breath. Far below the towers, the lake held the fading sky in a dark mirror. Across the courtyards, footsteps diminished one by one. Doors closed. Voices drifted away. Candles woke in their brackets and chandeliers, their flames mild and patient, as though they had been waiting for this hour when the castle could finally let the day go. There was nothing urgent in the air, no sharp message at the glass, no hurried running in the corridor, only the small sounds that belonged to Hogwarts when evening had become too drowsy to ask much of anyone. Somewhere in the distance, a page turned, a grate settled with a soft sigh of embers. A staircase adjusted itself by an inch or two, like an old cat choosing a better sleeping place. Even the portraits seemed content merely to watch the dimness gather. If one had wandered then through the castle without destination, it would have been easy to believe that Hogwarts loved this hour best of all. Lessons had released their grip. The corridors were long ribbons of hush. Above the great hall, the enchanted ceiling deepened from pearl to blue, and from blue to velvet, while the first stars took their places with the calm assurance of things that had never once doubted they would be seen. The castle noticed them. Hogwarts always noticed the stars, in towers and dormitories, in studies and window seats. The business of the day loosened its hold. Pens slowed, shoulders lowered. Even the sharpest minds allowed themselves the smallest drift, and threading through that quiet, too soft to be called music and too deliberate to be called chance, there was the feeling that the castle still had one last kindness to offer before sleep. Not a dramatic secret, not a burst of danger, nothing to wake the heart, only the sort of wonder Hogwarts preferred to share after sunset, when polished banisters, warm firelight, and dim corridors made discovery feel less like interruption and more like being invited, very gently, into another room. High in Gryffindor Tower, the common room was full of that unmistakable evening comfort that made even the most restless student slower in step. Firelight moved over the stone walls in wavering amber bands. The red hangings around the windows had darkened into wine and shadow. Cushions held the last warmth of whoever had recently left them. The great hearth glowed with deep orange embers beneath lively tongues of flame, and the scent rising from the logs carried applewood, a pinch of clove, and something faintly sweet that the house elves had taken to adding whenever autumn settled in properly. Outside, the grounds were fading toward twilight. A few figures crossed the lawn far below, reduced by distance to little moving specks against the silver-green grass. Their laughter came and went in such faint threads that it sounded less like noise than memory. Inside, however, the room belonged to quieter occupations. Someone near the window was mending a robe sleeve with slow and careful stitches. 2 second years played wizard chess with more yawns than strategy, their pieces arguing in hushed tones as if they too understood the hour. A pair of older students sat with books open on their knees, though both were plainly rereading the same line while they stared into the fire instead. At the center of it all was a warmth that felt older than the chairs, older even than the tower itself. Gryffindor Common Room in the evening had a way of gathering every scattered thought and drawing it closer to the hearth. The light was forgiving there. The shadows were deep but never unfriendly. Rain had not yet come, but the air hinted at it, and the windows held a thin mist at their edges, as though the night had already pressed one cool hand against the glass. On the mantel stood brass candlesticks, a squat clock with a sleepy face, a row of polished stones someone had once declared lucky, and, tucked among them as if it belonged there, a small lantern with blue-green panes. It was not the sort of object that demanded attention. One might have mistaken it for an old decorative thing left by some forgotten head of house. Yet every now and then, when the fire dipped or a silence deepened, the panes answered with a low inner glow, gentle as moonlight passing through colored water. Most students never noticed it. Hogwarts was full of objects like that, waiting quietly to be seen only by the person who happened to need them. Tonight, though, the lantern glimmered once, then went still again, as if testing whether anyone in the room was ready to look up. Ginny Weasley was stretched along the rug nearest the fire, propped on one elbow with a half-finished essay beside her and a quill tucked behind one ear. Every so often, she twirled her wand between her fingers without thinking, and tiny rings of warm gold drifted from the tip and dissolved in the air above her shoulder. It was a useless little charm, one she had invented for no purpose beyond amusement. But the soft circling sparks matched the room so well that no one asked her to stop. Nearby, Neville Longbottom sat on a low stool beside a narrow table he had drawn close to the window. On it rested 3 clay pots, a watering flask, and a shallow wooden tray lined with moss. Neville was examining the underside of a pale silver leaf with such patient concentration that it might have been a sacred text rather than a plant. Across from them, almost hidden by the high wing of an armchair, sat a first-year girl named Clara Bell. She had a small, thoughtful face, dark hair escaping from an untidy braid, and the expression of someone who still could not quite believe she had been allowed into the world she had spent years imagining. A book lay open in her lap, but she had long since stopped reading it. Instead, she watched the fire and the windows and the moving shadows on the ceiling, with the still wonder of a child trying not to miss anything. At length she rubbed one temple and gave a small sigh. Ginny looked over at once. Head again? Clara nodded, embarrassed by the attention. Only a little. The bright afternoons do it sometimes. It's silly. It isn't silly, said Neville gently, without looking up from the leaf. Some people don't much care for too much sun. Plants can be like that too. The moonwort in greenhouse 3 wilts if you leave it in the wrong light for half an hour. That earned the faintest laugh from Clara. Ginny sat up and tucked her essay aside. Then it's settled. You and Moonwort are in distinguished company. Clara smiled, but her eyes drifted once more around the room. I don't mind staying in. It only feels, she searched for the word, as though the castle is fuller on evenings like this. As though if you looked in the right place, you'd find something everyone else walked past. Neville's mouth lifted. That does sound like Hogwarts. Ginny followed Clara's gaze to the mantel, where the little blue-green lantern had brightened once more. This time, the glow did not fade at once. It trembled softly, deepening from sea-glass green to dusky blue. And for one peculiar second, it seemed less like a lantern and more like a listening eye. Has that always been there? Clara asked quietly. Neville turned. The lantern. I think so, or perhaps not. It looks as if it has. Ginny rose and crossed to the hearth, curiosity already warming her voice. That's exactly the sort of answer this castle likes best. As she came near, the lantern brightened in earnest. The brass handle gave a tiny chime against its ring, and from the shelf beneath it, where no mark had been visible before, a thread of pale light ran along the carved wood, down the side of the mantel, and across one seam in the stonework beside the fireplace, where it waited like a line that had just remembered it was meant to lead somewhere. No one else in the room seemed to notice the light. A chess piece coughed. Someone turned a page. The fire gave a low crackle and settled again. Yet the line in the stone had become unmistakable. A pale silver-blue seam tracing the outline of a narrow door beside the hearth. Ginny laid her hand against it first. The stone was warm, not hot, not alive exactly, but aware in the quiet, responsive way some old magical objects could be. The lantern chimed once more, brighter now, and the seam widened soundlessly until a slim panel of stone drew back into darkness. Behind it waited a staircase so narrow that it might once have been intended for servants or ghosts, and along its descending wall hung tiny empty brackets shaped to hold lanterns. All of them were dark except the first. The blue-green lantern had somehow left the mantel. It now rested in the nearest bracket, its panes luminous, as though it had always belonged there. Clara drew in the softest breath. Did it just move? Hogwarts, said Ginny, with the air of someone offering both explanation and surrender. Neville stood slowly, making sure his plants were tucked well away from the draft of the hidden opening. Do you suppose it means us to follow? The lantern answered for them. Its glow deepened and spilled down the first steps like water finding a channel. Not a command, not even an insistence, more like a patient suggestion. Ginny glanced toward the room. Nothing in it had changed. The fire still burned. The essays still waited. The ordinary evening remained in place as neatly as before, which somehow made the invitation easier to trust. We'll only have a look, she murmured. Neville gave her the sort of look that suggested he had heard versions of that sentence before, and seldom found them fully reassuring. But Clara's face had lit with the quietest kind of hope, and that settled the matter. Ginny took the lantern from its bracket. It felt unexpectedly light in her hand. The stair curved downward only a little before turning into a corridor. The walls were smooth, pale stone, older than the common room, and polished by time into a softness that reflected the lantern glow in blurred halos. Their footsteps made scarcely any sound. The air was cooler than the tower above, but not cold, and it carried a smell of old cedar, rain on slate, and the faint mineral freshness of water moving somewhere far within the castle. At regular intervals along the corridor were narrow windows, too tall and too slender to be ordinary panes. Their glass was slightly wavy, like old bottle glass, and each one held a different light. Through the first, Ginny expected to see a wall, or darkness, or perhaps one of the inner courtyards. Instead, she saw the great hall at dawn, entirely empty, the long tables bare, the enchanted ceiling washed in pearl and rose. Through the next window, Neville glimpsed a greenhouse in moonlight, every leaf silvered and still. Clara pressed close to a third, and found a snow-covered bridge beneath a lavender sky, with no figure crossing it, and no sound at all but imagined wind. It's not outside, she whispered. Or not outside now. Neville raised his hand to the glass, but did not touch it. Different hours, he said. Different moods, perhaps. Different ways the castle rests, said Ginny. The lantern grew warmer as they walked, and every new window opened onto some other quiet corner of Hogwarts. No one could reach at that moment except by looking. A classroom full of sleeping telescopes. A corridor before sunrise with only a single line of candlelight. The owlery under summer rain. The boathouse in autumn. None of it felt like spying. The windows seemed offered, not stolen, as if the castle wished to show them its softer faces, the ones most students hurried past. At the corridor's end hung a curtain of deep blue, velvet threaded with silver stars so faded they appeared only when the lantern passed close. The cloth stirred, although there was no breeze beyond it. A wider glow waited, tender and golden. Ginny lifted the edge of the curtain. On the other side was a circular room unlike any they had seen in Hogwarts before. The room seemed at first like a library, then like a sitting room, then like something in between and gentler than either. Shelves curved around the walls from floor to ceiling, but they did not hold books alone. There were clocks with stopped hands, folded maps, little boxes, rolled bits of parchment tied with ribbon, painted feathers, teacups with hairline cracks, a silver thimble, a marble that held a swirl of cloudy blue. The sort of ordinary and half-forgotten things people kept not because they were valuable, but because they had once mattered quietly. Between the shelves stood high-backed chairs, deep window seats, cushioned benches, and low tables with lamps shaded in amber silk. Hanging from the domed ceiling were dozens of lanterns, in different shapes and sizes: glass globes, hexagons, little ship lamps, brass stars, each lit from within by a calm and steady flame. The light they gave was not bright enough to dazzle. It seemed designed instead to rest on surfaces kindly, to make wood gleam softly and brass look old and beloved. In the middle of the floor lay a round mosaic of tiny tiles in muted blues, creams, moss greens, and russet red. From a distance it looked abstract. From nearer, Clara saw that it depicted the castle at night, with thin threads of light running through it from tower to tower, room to room, window to window. A web of warmth, a map of every place in Hogwarts where someone had once felt safe. There was no librarian waiting, no portrait to explain. The room made no speech and offered no grand sigh. Yet it did not feel empty. It felt attended in the way a well-kept guest room feels attended, with everything in its proper place because someone, sometime, had cared enough to prepare it. On a table near the center stood 3 unlit lamps. As the children approached, each lamp flared to life one after another. The first gave off a greenish-silver glow and filled the air around it with the cool scent of soil after rain. The second shone warm gold and smelled faintly of clean wind and broom polish. The third glimmered with soft pearl light and carried a note of lavender, parchment, and a sweetness Clara could not name, but somehow associated with home. Neville looked at the first lamp in wonder. Tiny shapes had begun to move inside its glass. Not flames exactly, but miniature leaves, unfolding, and roots threading down through dark, enchanted earth. Ginny's lamp held something else when she bent toward it. The gold light gathered itself into swirling lines that became the outline of a broom trail, then a tower roof, then a narrow path across the battlements lit only by stars. Clara's lamp remained still for a moment longer, and then small images began to bloom in its pearl center. A first-year trunk with brass corners, a hand smoothing a bed cover, a candle in a dark dormitory, a pair of shoes left tidily beside a chair, and a window seat where someone sat alone, not unhappily, simply listening to the rain. "I think," Neville said very softly, "it knows us." A narrow drawer slid open in the nearest shelf with a polite click. Inside lay 3 slim notebooks with plain covers, one moss green, one warm brown, one midnight blue. No names were written on them, yet each child knew at once which one belonged to whom. Ginny opened hers first. Instead of text, the pages showed moving sketches, delicate as charmed pencil drawing. There were little-known passages along rooflines, overlooked alcoves above staircases, hidden benches in warm corners of towers, and modest adventures from past students who had found themselves wandering the castle after supper, and discovering places no map had ever thought to record. Not mischief, not rule-breaking for its own sake. Rather those small, half-secret excursions by which a school slowly becomes home. Neville's notebook was full of quiet gardens, not the official greenhouses, but neglected pockets of living green tucked into the castle's forgotten spaces. A fern shelf behind an unused classroom, moonflowers trained along an inner archway, a patch of moss bright as emerald velvet under a dripping gargoyle, tiny herb beds maintained over generations by anonymous hands that had left no plaque and asked no recognition. Clara turned the first page of hers with almost ceremonial care. The drawings there did not show famous witches or remarkable spells. They showed first evenings, a child pretending to be brave as a parent waved goodbye at King's Cross, a nervous student tracing the stitching of new blankets, someone standing in a corridor at dusk because they did not yet know which staircase led home. Then, always, some quiet kindness, an older student pointing the way, a house elf leaving warm milk by a bedside, a portrait calling a child by the correct name when no one else had yet remembered it. Clara swallowed, and though she did not speak, Ginny and Neville both understood. The room invited them to sit, not with a command, but with the sheer obvious comfort of it. Neville took a chair near a low lamp, whose shade was painted with leaves. Ginny settled cross-legged in a window seat, from which she could see not the grounds, but a shifting twilight sky no real window could have contained. Clara tucked herself into the curve of a soft armchair that seemed to know the exact right height for a small, tired body. Time thinned there. They read. They breathed. Every so often one of the lanterns overhead brightened a little, and then eased back, as though the room were listening and pleased by their silence. Somewhere water dripped in a steady, soothing rhythm. Once, faintly, a bell far off in the castle marked the quarter hour, but it reached them so softened by distance that it sounded less like time passing and more like a reminder that time could be gentle. After a while, the books changed. In Neville's, careful notes in many unknown hands appeared in the margins, each one offering little observations on roots, lunar planting, scents, soil, and patience. In Ginny's, the drawn pathways broadened into glimpses of students from different generations, laughing on parapets, trading stories in lookout nooks, or simply sitting shoulder to shoulder above the sleeping school. In Clara's, the first evening scenes deepened into something warmer still, proof, page after page, that homesickness and wonder could live in the same chest without fighting, and that belonging often arrived quietly, one corner, one person, one evening at a time. No one grew sleepy exactly. The room did something subtler than that. It softened the edges of thought. It took the day's leftover sharpness and set it down elsewhere. By the time Ginny finally looked up, the lantern in her hand. Yes, she realized then that she had been holding it all along, had deepened to a calm midnight blue. Across the room, on a side table, near the shelves of quiet objects, 3 small things had appeared. A brass leaf, a little gold thread wound around itself in the shape of a loop, a smooth white pebble with a line of blue through its center, like a tiny captured horizon. Neville closed his notebook first. "Do you think," he asked in a whisper suited to the room, "that we're meant to take them?" Ginny glanced toward the shelves, toward the lanterns, toward the domed ceiling full of steady light. No one answered, but beside the blue curtain through which they had entered, another curtain had already parted on its own, revealing a passage lit with the warmest amber glow they had yet seen. That seemed answer enough. The new passage rose rather than descended. It was broader than the corridor of windows and carpeted in faded red, as though at some point it had decided to imitate Gryffindor Tower out of affection. The walls here held framed sketches instead of windows. Each one showed a tiny scene in charcoal and wash, a kettle steaming on a dormitory hearth, boots drying beside a door, a snowy owl tucked under one wing, candles burning low over abandoned homework. Ordinary things, resting things, the sort of moments no one ever thought to remember, and yet missed terribly the instant they were gone. As they climbed, the air grew warmer and more familiar. The scent of cedar faded. In its place came smoke, old books, wool, and the unmistakable comfort of the common room. Clara turned once, expecting perhaps to catch a last glimpse of the circular room, but the passage behind them no longer showed blue curtain or silver-threaded stone. It bent softly into shadow, private and complete. At the top waited not a dramatic gate, nor a carved door, but a simple panel of oak with a lion head handle polished by generations of hands. Ginny pressed it down. The panel opened without a sound. They stepped straight back into Gryffindor Tower. The fire had scarcely changed. The chess match by the window still advanced at its lazy pace. One of the readers by the hearth had fallen asleep over her book, and was now being gently nudged awake by a portrait of a stern witch who had evidently decided drooling on parchment was beneath Gryffindor standards. Ginny's essay lay where she had left it, Neville's plants stood serene on the little table, and the mantel, where the lantern had rested before, now showed only the sleepy brass clock and the row of lucky stones. Neville checked the watch in his pocket, frowned, then checked it again. That can't be right. No time? Ginny asked. Hardly any. His voice held more delight than alarm. A minute, perhaps two. Clara was already turning the smooth white pebble in her palm. She did not remember picking it up, yet there it was, cool and reassuring. Neville found the brass leaf in his pocket, tucked neatly beside a bit of string and a folded handkerchief. Ginny discovered the golden loop had somehow wound itself around the cord at her wrist, where it shone like an old charm she had owned for years. None of them spoke for several seconds. It was not that words were impossible, only unnecessary. At last Clara went back to her chair and sat down slowly, as if she were afraid a sudden movement might crack the memory. I think, she said, looking into the fire, that Hogwarts likes when people notice the quiet parts. Neville smiled and returned to his plants, though his hands moved with unusual gentleness, as if every leaf might now conceal another secret. That sounds true. Ginny dropped back onto the hearthrug and picked up her quill, but she did not begin writing. Instead, she watched the fire and the students and the dimming windows with a new kind of attention. The room had not changed at all, and yet it felt wider, deeper. Every ordinary corner might hold another kindness. Every shadow beside a bookshelf might be not emptiness, but waiting. Soon the others who had been outside began to return in little bursts of cold air and chatter. The quiet evening loosened into the friendly clutter of house life. Cloaks were shaken out, boots thudded down. Someone loudly declared the grounds too muddy for civilized existence. Someone else argued that civilization had never been the point of Quidditch boots. Laughter spread. A door slammed. 2 first-years ran up the girls' stair in a breathless panic over a lost charm textbook that was, as it turned out, already under one of their beds. The common room filled, and the secret folded itself away. Yet when Clara bent to retrieve her forgotten book, she found tucked between its pages a narrow strip of vellum no wider than a finger. On it, in tiny silver writing that faded even as she read, were the words, "Some rooms are only visible once. Some are waiting to be recognized again." She looked up sharply, across the room. Ginny was touching the charm at her wrist with thoughtful eyes. Neville had gone still over one of his pots, where a small shoot no one had noticed before had lifted itself through the soil and unfurled a leaf, the exact shape of the brass token in his pocket. Nothing more happened then. No wall opened, no lantern returned. And that was part of the sweetness of it. Hogwarts did not rush its gifts. It let them settle like embers, warm and enduring, while the evening moved on. Later, when the tower had grown loud with returning students, and the castle's first deeper hush of night began to gather beyond the portrait hole, another light was burning elsewhere, in another quiet room full of books and dust and patient corners, where one student had not yet thought of sleep. The library after curfew belonged to another species of silence entirely. It was not the warm silence of common rooms, full of fabric and breathing and fire. It was a taller silence, made of shelves, ink, polished tables, and the faint dry whisper of pages settling under her own weight. Hermione Granger loved it with the deep devotion other people reserved for gardens or music. By the time most students had gone upstairs, the library became less a room than a state of mind. Thought seemed to move more clearly there. Even candlelight behaved itself, resting in calm gold pools instead of flickering with needless drama. That night, she had spread her work across a table near the rear windows where the moon, thin and pale, laid a faint silver stripe along the boards. An essay on transfiguration stood nearly complete. 2 reference volumes waited open beside a stack of notes. Her quill scratched steadily. Now and then, she paused to push back a strand of hair or to glance toward the darkened panes. where the grounds dissolved into reflection and starshine. Madame Pince had already reminded her twice that extended privileges were not an invitation to become nocturnal furniture. Hermione had smiled, promised to finish soon, and continued exactly as before, though perhaps a touch more quickly. It was only when a sound unlike turning pages reached her from somewhere beyond the history shelves that she stopped at last. The noise was very slight, not a thump, not a scrape, more like paper sighing. Hermione listened. There it was again, farther back, in one of the narrow side aisles, where the lamps always seemed a little dimmer, and the subjects grew odder. She capped her ink, set down her quill, and stood. The library, being the library, immediately made her aware of her own footsteps, so she adjusted her pace until they barely whispered. The sound led her past educational theory, obscure magical law, 18th century wand practices, and finally into an alcove she would have sworn had not existed when she sat down an hour earlier. There was no dramatic shift in the architecture, only a small turn between two shelving units, and then, quite suddenly, a recess containing a single round table, a lamp with green silk shade, and a book lying closed in the exact center as if it had been placed there for her convenience. The cover was dark blue, worn at the edges, and stamped with no title. Hermione did not touch it immediately. She had attended Hogwarts long enough to know that untitled books appearing in unexpected alcoves after curfew could not be classified as ordinary opportunities. Yet nothing about it felt threatening. It had none of the cold watchfulness she associated with dangerous magic. Instead, it held the quiet expectancy of a chair drawn up beside the fire before anyone sits in it. She lifted her wand and murmured a revealing charm. A soft wash of pale gold spread over the cover and faded. No jagged sparks, no alarming crimson flare. If the book was enchanted, the enchantment was old, thoughtful, and restrained. Hermione drew out the chair and sat. When she laid her fingertips on the cover, she had the peculiar sensation of touching something that had been waiting in perfect patience for a very long time. The leather was warm. She opened it. The first page was blank. So was the second. She turned a third, half expecting invisible ink. But before she could speak a spell, fine writing began to appear in the center of the page. The letters flowed slowly, as if thought into being rather than penned. "Good evening, Miss Granger. The library is loveliest when it is almost empty, don't you think?" Hermione blinked once, hard. Most people would have dropped the book. Hermione instead leaned closer. The ink shifted again. "You may speak aloud. It is less lonely that way. Who are you?" she whispered before she had decided whether she ought to. The answer came at once. "A keeper, when memory requires keeping. A page, when forgetting grows too easy. Tonight, if you are willing." A story. Hermione stared at the moving lines, and for one fleeting second the whole thing reminded her of another diary, another set of words appearing on a page. The memory chilled her enough that she nearly closed the cover at once. But this felt nothing like that cold old malice. The room around her remained calm. The green-shaded lamp gave off a mild circle of light. The book did not pull. It did not push. It simply waited. "A story about what?" she asked. The ink paused, as if considering how best to answer. "About the kind of courage no trophy case is built to hold." Hermione had just opened her mouth again when quick footsteps approached from the main aisle, followed by a familiar male voice, trying and failing to sound discreet. "Hermione, are you still—" Oh, Ron Weasley appeared around the shelf end first, his hair in need of sleep and his tie hanging loose in that particular way which suggested he had set out to tell Hermione to stop working and had somehow brought Harry along for support. Harry came in just behind him, glasses slightly crooked, both boys stopping short at the sight of the strange alcove and the book glowing quietly in Hermione's hands. "We were told the library swallowed you," said Ron. "By which I mean," Ginny said, "if you weren't upstairs in 10 minutes, she'd assume you'd eloped with a stack of reference books." Harry glanced from Hermione's face to the open page. "What's that?" Hermione hesitated, only long enough to decide that any book capable of greeting her by name had probably already accounted for an audience. "I'm not entirely sure yet," she said, "but I think it wants to tell us something." As if in agreement, fresh writing curled across the page. 3 readers. Better. Some stories prefer witnesses. Harry and Ron pulled up chairs without being asked. The alcove felt oddly roomy once they sat, as though the shelves had edged back to make space for the conversation. Hermione turned the page. This time, instead of words alone, a wash of color spread through the paper and formed an illustration so delicate it looked painted in breath and moonlight. It showed Hogwarts in winter. Snow lay in the corners of the battlements and softened the angles of the roofs. The lake was dark steel beneath a pale sky. In the foreground stood a girl of perhaps 16, in robes cut in an older style, with neat dark hair and a lantern held close against the wind. She was not posed heroically. She looked like someone on an errand. Yet there was a steadiness in the way she carried the light that made all 3 of the present students lean nearer. "Her name is Elspeth Marin," the page wrote. "Hufflepuff House. 6th year. She preferred small corridors, warm tea, and orderly shelves. In official recollections, she is not often mentioned. That is why I remember her. A Hufflepuff," Ron said softly, sounding pleased by the thought of the castle choosing to honor someone other than the usual suspects. The picture shifted. Now Elspeth sat at a long table mending a scarf while younger students around her talked over cocoa. Then another image. Elspeth in the library returning books in neat stacks. Then another. Elspeth crossing a courtyard in fog with her shoulders hunched against the cold, lanterns swinging at her side. "She looks ordinary," Harry said. The letters brightened. "Exactly." Hermione smiled despite herself. "That's rather the point, isn't it?" The book went on. In her 6th year, there came a week of extraordinary fog. It rose from the grounds, settled over the lake, drifted into the courtyards, and leaned so gently against the windows that morning and afternoon seemed made of the same pale hour. The castle did not mind the fog. Hogwarts rarely minded weather, but in the North Music Gallery, old echo charms woke in the damp after many silent decades, and younger students were left uncertain how much of what they heard belonged to the corridor, and how much belonged to memory. The illustration deepened into motion. They saw the North Passage, narrow-windowed and silvered with moisture, with tapestries dimmed by age and tiles, made glossy by the mist tracked in on shoes and hems. At the far end hung a sign turned sideways on its chain, difficult to read through the haze. Ron admitted he had never heard of the music gallery, and Hermione, with the calm of someone who no longer found Hogwarts capable of surprising her in ordinary ways, murmured that the castle was perfectly able to keep a few more rooms than anyone could count. The next page showed a little group of first years after supper, cloaks too large, cheeks pink from the cold, following one another through the wrong passage with the misplaced confidence that belongs especially to children in Shortcut. Their laughter came out in white puffs. Then the fog thickened, lamps became halos. The corridor lost its edges. Nothing in the picture became violent. That was not the trouble. The trouble was that the air itself began to answer them. The first sound was only a single note, thin and uncertain, as if a violin somewhere farther down. The corridor were testing whether it still remembered a tune. Then came other pieces of old music, not whole melodies, but fragments returning from the walls in softened form. The brush of a chair leg, the distant hum of practice scales, a phrase from a chorus repeated gently and without end. In another setting, it might have been beautiful. To lost children in a corridor of fog, it was simply too much to understand at once. "You're not meant to," said Hermione, though even she felt the small cold stir of unease along her arms. The writing returned. The book explained that the younger students did not know the old gallery had once been full of practice rooms, nor that charms had been laid there long ago to preserve and reflect sound. Damp had loosened those charms. Every whisper returned, altered. Every footstep borrowed an echo. The corridor was not dangerous. It was only confusing, which for very young students can feel nearly the same for a little while. The page showed the first years stopping in a cluster. One child reached for another's sleeve. Someone began to cry. Not loudly, only in that breathy and bewildered way children do when they have not yet learned whether fear should be named, ignored, or held by the hand until it passes. Then Elspeth appeared, not striding in like a storybook heroine, but simply turning the corner with her lantern and pausing at the first sign that someone needed steadier company. In one hand, she carried a covered basket from which a little steam still rose. She had been on her way to deliver honey cakes and fresh tea towels to the music mistress. The page explained, and had every reason to continue on her own errand. Instead, she stopped at once, because she recognized the sound of young fear even before she saw the children clearly. Harry's gaze had gone very still on the page. That's always how it begins, isn't it? Someone could walk away, and doesn't. The book accepted that with a moment of blankness, then moved on. When Elspeth stepped into the fog, the children could not at first see her face. They saw only the lantern. She did not ask them to be brave. She did not say there was nothing to fear. She simply made her voice easy and said, "You are not lost anymore. I have found you." All three readers sat quietly with that for a moment. The next lines appeared more slowly. Some kinds of courage arrive carrying a wand. Some arrive carrying a light, and the right sentence at the right time. The page shimmered, inviting them onward. Hermione turned it. The fog in the illustration thickened until even the lantern's edge softened. Elspeth moved carefully, not quickly, because the children were already frightened enough. She set the basket down on the floor and lifted the lantern a little higher. Its light was not bright, but it was calm, and calm was what the corridor most lacked. The first years crowded toward it at once, the oldest among them, a narrow-faced boy with spectacles sliding down his nose, attempted to explain between gulps of embarrassed breath that they had only meant to take a shorter route, that no one had intended to go where they should not, that the corridor had sounded empty at first and then had begun sounding full. Another child insisted someone was singing inside the wall. A girl with wet lashes said she had heard her mother calling from the other end of the passage. Elspeth listened to every word as though all of it mattered. Then she nodded, because to children on the edge of panic, being believed often matters more than being corrected. "The gallery is playing tricks with old echoes," she told them. "It likes damp weather and foolish shortcuts, that is all. It has no teeth, and it has no hands. And tonight it will have no audience either." The line of ink paused, then added, perhaps with amusement. Elspeth disliked dramatics, and therefore had a talent for dissolving them. The page showed her kneeling so that her face came level with the smallest child's. She untied the cloth from the basket, and revealed not only folded tea towels, but still warm honey cakes, wrapped in paper, and a squat teapot sealed with a charm to keep it hot. The absurd domesticity of the thing in that eerie corridor was so unexpectedly perfect that even Ron laughed under his breath. "She brought snacks," he said, delighted. "She brought equilibrium," Hermione corrected, though she smiled as she said it. Elspeth handed one honey cake to each child before doing anything else. She pressed a warm towel into the hands of the girl who had been crying, and asked her to hold it against her cheeks. She told the spectacled boy to carry the basket because she required an assistant. She told another child to keep one hand on the hem of her cloak, and another to count backward from 20 whenever the gallery repeated a sound that wasn't theirs. In other words, she gave fear smaller jobs until it had less room to grow. Then the corridor changed. What had so far been merely unsettling became dangerous in the way only Hogwarts could manage. Not through violence, but through enchantment, misbehaving beyond its intention. The loosened echo charms took the children's voices, the lantern chime, the rustle of cloth, and bounced them along the tiled hall, until the sounds began overlapping into a false geography. A footstep seemed to come from ahead, though it had been made behind. A whisper doubled, then tripled, then drifted upward from the ceiling. The fog swallowed the far wall. In the confusion, one child pulled away from the group, certain he had heard someone calling his name from a side passage. He vanished into white. Elspeth straightened at once. The illustration blurred with motion as the remaining children began to tremble and call out. She could not simply run after the missing boy. If she did, the others would scatter. She could not raise her voice, because the gallery would only fling it back in fragments. She could not rely on ordinary spells to clear the air, because the corridor's damp old magic had already started distorting simple charms. So she did something stranger, and much better suited to the hour. She began to sing, not loudly, not prettily perhaps, at least not in any grand performance sense. It was a low, steady tune, the sort one might hum while kneading dough or carrying linens upstairs. A domestic melody, repetitive and warm, too plain for the gallery's old vanity to enjoy distorting. The charmed echoes seized upon it and sent it back, but because the song had no sharpness in it, the copies came back softened, layered, strangely soothing. The corridor, which had moments earlier seemed full of lurking tricks, now held one continuous ribbon of sound. The missing boy answered with a frightened call. This time Elspeth knew where he was. The page showed her moving through the fog with the lantern held low, following not the false directions thrown by the corridor, but the break in her own returned tune. She reached the boy where he stood at the threshold of a practice chamber, whose door had swung open by itself. Within, rows of old music stands glimmered like thin, dark figures in the haze. Any younger student might have mistaken them for people waiting. Elspeth did not tell him not to be silly. She only crouched, offered him her free hand, and continued the tune, as if nothing at all alarming had happened. The boy took her hand immediately. Together they returned to the others. One by one she guided the children along the wall, the lantern in front, the song between them, until they reached the junction where the ordinary castle air took back its proper shape and the fog lost its confidence. There, at last, another adult arrived. The music mistress, flustered and shawl-draped, followed by a prefect and 2 house elves with extra lamps. The younger students were led away toward cocoa, blankets, and dormitory hearths. Elspeth remained in the passage. The music mistress, a tiny witch with silver spectacles and sternly braided hair, examined the damp tiles, the trembling lantern light, and the still open practice chamber door. Her expression moved through relief, annoyance, and something like worry. "You must say nothing of this corridor at breakfast," she told Elspeth quietly once the children were gone. The North Gallery was supposed to be sealed until all residual charm work had been lifted. If the governors hear that the restoration ward failed. Hermione rolled her eyes on instinct. There it is. The book did not argue. The page only continued. Elspeth might have protested. She might have demanded recognition, complained of the risk, asked whether those children would at least be told the truth of what frightened them. Instead, she looked down the dim hall, now once more only a corridor, and asked a different question. Will someone put proper lamps there tomorrow? The music mistress stared at her, then answered, yes. Will the youngest students be warned away until it is fixed? Yes. Will someone make sure they are not teased for being frightened? A pause. Then yes again. Only then did Elspeth nod. That night, no medal was struck. No points were awarded in the great hall. The children reached their beds with warm hands and full stomachs, and by morning, the gallery doors were covered and quiet. In official records, the incident became a line in a maintenance ledger about moisture and outdated acoustic words. But several of the children, long afterward, remembered not the corridor, not the false voices, not even the fear. They remembered the lantern. They remembered the smell of honey and tea. They remembered a song plain enough to follow home. For a little while, no one in the alcove spoke. The library beyond their hidden corner remained as it had been all along. Lamps low, shelves still, the moon faint beyond the windows. Yet the quiet now felt shared with another time. Harry sat with his hands folded, staring at the place on the page where the lantern had been drawn. Ron leaned back slowly, as though the story had taken some weight from him, and he was not yet sure where it had gone. Hermione turned the paper with unusual care, half hoping for more and half unwilling to hurry the end. The next page held not an illustration, but a neat entry in a hand that was clearly Elspeth's own. It described no fear and claimed no praise. She wrote only that younger students could be steadied by warm food faster than by lectures, that old corridors ought never to be left underlit, and that songs one would be embarrassed to sing before a crowd could prove the most useful in moments requiring calm. The matter-of-fact tone made the entire account more moving, not less. It was the voice of someone who had done what was needed and then gone on folding tea towels. "She sounds wonderful," Harry said. "She sounds sensible," said Hermione. "Same thing sometimes," said Ron. The writing at the bottom of the page brightened. For many years she was remembered only by those she led back. Then those children grew up. Memory thinned. The corridor was repaired. The song was forgotten. Such things happen. It is no tragedy. But neither is it unimportant to remember that a school is held together by many quiet acts. No feast can honor properly. The next illustration showed Elspeth much older, not at Hogwarts, but in a small cottage lined with crockery and herb jars. She stood at an open window, hanging tea towels to dry, while children, grandchildren perhaps, or neighborhood pupils sat at her table listening. The lantern from the corridor, now plainly ordinary brass, stood on a shelf behind her. Did she ever tell them? Hermione asked softly. At once the answer appeared, only once, and even then she made it funny. She thought the best part of the story was not that she had been brave, but that one must never underestimate a basket of cakes. Ron grinned. I like her better every second, the book seemed. If a book could seem anything, please. The final page in the sequence showed the North Music Gallery years later, dry and repaired, filled not with fog but afternoon sunlight. A violin rested on a chair. A row of fresh lamps gleamed on the wall. The corridor had become safe enough that no one gave it much thought, which Hermione supposed was exactly what Elspeth would have wanted. Then new writing came, addressed unmistakably to them. You wondered, Miss Granger, what kind of story this was. It is the kind the castle itself prefers, not because greater deeds matter less, but because smaller ones are so often the beams hidden behind the painted walls. Remove enough of them, and everything beautiful begins to sag. Hermione's expression softened. She closed the book halfway, considering, is that why you appear? She asked, to preserve what doesn't make it into Hogwarts, a history? The answer formed more slowly now, as if the book had grown sleepy. Among other reasons, there are many ledgers in the world. Few record warmth accurately. Behind them came the faint sound of approaching steps. This time, the footsteps were measured, dry, and unmistakable. Madame Pince rounded the shelf end with the air of a witch who expected to discover precisely the sort of nonsense she had left behind and was almost offended to find instead 3 students sitting respectfully around a single open volume. Her eyes narrowed, not at the students, at the book. "Oh," she said, and to Harry's astonishment, the word held neither anger nor suspicion, only recognition. "That one? You know it?" Hermione asked. "I know of it," said Madame Pince. She moved closer, and though her face remained severe, her gloved hand touched the table edge with unusual gentleness. "It does not show itself frequently, which is probably just as well. The library would never rest if students believed every vanished kindness had been catalogued somewhere between herbology and hexes." Ron looked from librarian to book and back. "So it's real?" Madame Pince gave him a look that suggested the question was beneath discussion. "Mr. Weasley, in this castle, even imaginary books have usually become real by Wednesday." For the briefest moment, Harry thought the corner of Hermione's mouth might split into open laughter. Madame Pince looked down at the closing pages. "You may finish your reading. Then I shall return it. Where does it go?" Harry asked. "Where it is remembered," she said, which in a library was either a precise answer or none at all. She turned and walked back into the dark shelves, leaving behind a faint scent of starch and lavender polish. Hermione looked at the boys. Neither spoke. She laid her palm over the cover and felt the remaining warmth there. When she finally closed the book, a single loose paper slipped from within and landed on the table. It was not old. It was new, creamy, and blank, but for one line in the center. "Whenever a corridor grows kinder, because someone once chose calm, the story is still continuing." No one rushed to interpret that. They didn't need to. The library around them felt softer now, as if all its shelves held not merely information, but tenderness, arranged by subject. Harry rose first. Ron yawned. Hermione gathered her notes, though she knew she would remember far more of the night than anything she had been writing before. As they stepped out of the alcove, it was already disappearing. By the time Hermione glanced back from the main aisle, there were only shelves, shadow, and one ordinary lamp burning in its place. Yet, somewhere above the castle, while they made their slow way toward the door and the staircases beyond, the sky had begun preparing another kind of wonder, one that required no books at all, only a girl in a tower who had always known that stars were seldom as silent as they pretended. Midnight at Hogwarts had a clarity all its own. The castle never truly slept, not with portraits muttering in their frames and staircases occasionally reconsidering their loyalties. But there came an hour when wakefulness itself changed texture. The air grew fine and cool. Stone released the day's last warmth. Sounds became solitary and exact. A latch, an owl. Wind touching the outer wall. Anyone awake then felt less like part of school life and more like a small companion to the castle's older consciousness. Luna Lovegood sat on the broad sill of a Ravenclaw window with her knees drawn up and her chin resting lightly on them. The night beyond the glass was washed in starshine. From that height, the grounds looked almost unreal. The black shine of the lake, the pale suggestion of paths, the dark folded mass of the forest. But Luna was not looking at the grounds. She was watching the spaces between the stars. To other eyes, the constellations might have seemed ordinary. To Luna, they looked deliberate. Not brighter exactly, but attentive. Certain points glimmered in answer to one another with the composure of people exchanging thoughts across a very large room. Once or twice, a line she had always known between two stars appeared to loosen, only to join elsewhere. It was not disorder. It was rearrangement. She placed one hand against the window. "There you are," she murmured, as though greeting something that had arrived later than expected but exactly on the right night. But on her lap lay a notebook filled with sketches of moon phases, improbable creatures, and patient observations about the sky. Tonight she added no sketch. She simply watched until another detail made itself known. Far above the clustered roofs of Hogwarts, the astronomy tower was wearing a faint silver halo, not given by moonlight alone. That decided matters. Luna left the window in her usual unhurried way, slipping her notebook under one arm and her wand into the pocket of her dressing gown. In a corridor outside, the carved eagle knocker on the tower door regarded her with sleepy bronze eyes. "Going somewhere interesting?" it asked. "Yes," said Luna. The eagle considered. "That is not an answer. It often is," said Luna. And because the eagle was too tired for argument, or perhaps too curious to object, the door opened. The castle at that hour received her, as if it had expected her feet. Portraits dozed. A suit of armor on the landing had fallen into such a profound slumber that its helmet had tipped sideways. The windows held smooth squares of star-glossed dark. Luna passed through all of it, as though walking underwater, gently and without disturbance. At the landing near Gryffindor Tower, she encountered Dean Thomas and Seamus Finnegan in cloaks hastily thrown over pajamas, each carrying contraband toast, wrapped in a napkin. They stopped. She stopped. No one seemed surprised for very long. "You've got the look," said Seamus at last. Luna tilted her head. "Which one?" "The one that means either something very interesting or very strange is happening." Dean glanced down the corridor toward the silver-lit height of the astronomy tower. "We were on our way to the kitchens, but I suspect your destination is better." "The stars are reorganizing their thoughts," Luna said, "and the tower is answering." Seamus chewed that over with admirable seriousness. "Right. Better then," Dean smiled. "Do we need the toast?" "Yes," said Luna, after brief consideration. Night excursions improve with provisions. So the three of them set off together, the napkin-wrapped toast included, while the silver halo above the tower slowly brightened, not enough to alarm anyone who was asleep, only enough to suggest that the sky had left a lantern burning for those awake enough to notice. The climb to the astronomy tower felt shorter than usual, perhaps because the castle quietly assisted them. A staircase that was often stubborn held still until they crossed it. A corridor that typically branched in three directions offered only the one they needed. The silver light grew cleaner with every landing, spilling across the steps in thin bands, as if the tower were filling from above. When they reached the top, the night opened around them in a vast circle of cool air. The astronomy platform was empty of people, but not of presence. Telescopes stood along the railing, with their brass fittings silvered by the strange glow. Charts lay weighted on a table, their corners barely lifting in the breeze. Above all of it arched the sky, immense and lucid and far more awake than any sky had a right to be at that hour. Dean exhaled first. Oh, it was all anyone needed to say for a moment. The stars were moving, not quickly. The stars did not hurry themselves for human understanding. They moved with the slow assurance of pieces on an enormous board finding the places meant for them all along. Lines stretched, loosened, and reformed. One cluster leaned into the shape of a branch, another widened into wings. Pale rings linked themselves and drifted apart again, so calm in their movement that even Seamus stopped thinking in jokes for a little while. Dean said it felt less like watching a picture form and more like watching meaning gather before it decided on words. The silver on the stones around them deepened. It no longer seemed to fall only from above. The tower was answering too, drawing the starlight down through old mortar and holding it in the fine cracks between the paving stones until the floor looked faintly frosted. Then one image gathered itself more fully than the rest. Across the southern sky, the stars became a great tree whose roots reached toward the horizon and whose branches spread so wide they seemed to cradle half the night. That held for a breath, then narrowed and lifted into the long shape of a bird rising upward. The bird dissolved into a key. The key became a ring of windows around a dark center. "No," she said. "If they did, People would become tiresome about it. Luna did not pretend she understood every symbol at once. What mattered first was not certainty, but attention. The stars shifted again. This time the image was unmistakable, even to sleep-heavy eyes. Hogwarts itself, rendered in silver points. Towers, bridges, roofs, and turrets hovered over the real castle with impossible clarity. Then one portion brightened high on the 7th floor, and in that brightened place, the suggestion of a door emerged. Beneath it appeared the shape of a basin or bowl, round and luminous. Something meant not for holding water, but for holding what light remembers. Dean felt, rather than said, that the sky was showing them a room, and something waiting inside it. Luna thought the same. A vessel for looking, perhaps, or for remembering. Seamus, still practical, even under extraordinary skies, observed that all of it seemed to be pointing them back down into the castle. He was right. The image of Hogwarts dissolved, and in its place, a simple silver path sloped from the tower toward the 7th floor. Along the path glimmered smaller stars in a patient line. At the end waited the door once more. The air around them changed. A tone entered it, too low to be called music, and too even to be mistaken for wind in the arches. It vibrated in the railings, in the telescopes, in the stone, under their palms. Dean felt it against his ribs. Seamus felt it in his teeth. Luna closed her eyes, listening. "They're not only showing us where to go," she said. "They're asking the castle to open the way properly." As if in answer, the nearest telescope turned of its own accord and angled downward toward the west wing. In its polished barrel appeared not the moon, but a corridor lined with tapestry. "The 7th floor," said Dean, "near the Barnabas wall," said Seamus at once, recognizing it from all the times rumor had sent students there in search of things they urgently needed or urgently wished to hide. Luna smiled into the wind. "Then we shouldn't keep the stars waiting." They descended at once, though not in a rush. Nothing about the night encouraged rushing. The platform behind them remained silver as bone under moonlight, and the sky continued its majestic reordering overhead. Yet, the strongest brightness now lay lower, hidden within the castle itself, where a room not often asked for was beginning to remember the shape of this particular need. The corridor on the 7th floor was quiet enough to hear the castle thinking. Tapestries hung heavy in the dimness. The windows admitted only small panels of starlight. Opposite the familiar tapestry of the wizard trying to teach trolls ballet, the blank stretch of wall waited with deceptive plainness. Luna stopped before it and set her notebook against her chest. "We need to be precise." "About what?" asked Seamus. "About the kind of memory we're asking for," she said. "Not just a room to hide in. Not just a room to see something interesting. A room where the castle keeps nights like this." Dean nodded, as if that made perfect sense, and perhaps it did at such an hour. Together, they walked past the wall, once, twice, 3 times. Each time they held the same thought as steadily as they could. A place to understand the speaking stars. A place where the castle might keep what the sky entrusted to it. A place where those who noticed could notice more. On the 3rd pass, the stone shivered, lines appeared, faint at first, and then brightening into silver constellations set within the rough wall, as if the plaster had always concealed them. The stars joined, widened, and became the outline of a door. Its handle was shaped not like a lion or an eagle, but like a crescent moon, cradling a single point of light. When Luna pressed it down, the door opened inward at once. The room beyond was round and high-domed, with walls washed in the blue-black of deepest night. Yet it was not dark. Light moved there in quiet forms. Starfields drifting over the ceiling, silver reflections traveling over the floor, pale lantern glow gathered in niches. At the center stood an orrery, unlike any Professor Sinistra would have used in class. It rose from the floor in a lattice of fine brass arms, each holding a shallow crystal bowl, no larger than 2 cupped hands. 7 bowls circled the center at different heights, and inside each one floated a slow spiral of shining dust. Around the walls stood tall cabinets with glass doors. Behind the panes rested objects, arranged with almost ceremonial care. Astrolabes, old charts, folded cloaks, broken compass needles, quills, tiny glass vials, dried garlands of night-blooming flowers, a child's sketch of stars pricked through with needle holes, a ribbon the color of moonlit smoke. Not treasures of price, treasures of occasion. Seamus removed the toast from the napkin and tucked it guiltily into a pocket. "I feel," he said under his breath, "that it would be rude to eat in here." Dean stepped closer to the orrery. Suspended above the central spindle was a disc of polished black glass, no wider than a dinner plate. It reflected none of them. Instead, it showed a slow-turning sky. "Look," he whispered. Set into the brass rim beneath each crystal bowl was a silver plaque. Luna moved from one to the next, reading softly. Names, dates, houses, not every century, but many. A Ravenclaw from the 12th century, a Slytherin from the late 15th, a charms professor, a groundskeeper's daughter permitted 1 year within the castle, a pair of twins from the 1720s who had apparently contributed the same night from 2 very different points of view. The most recent date among them was old enough that no one living at Hogwarts now would have met the owner. "These are witnesses," Luna said, "not to the whole sky. To one kind of night." The central glass darkened, then brightened. Across it appeared a line of silver writing as fluid as frost forming on a window. "When the stars speak together, Hogwarts listens. When Hogwarts listens, some part of the listening is kept." Dean looked around slowly, his face altered by the blue light. "So every time the sky does this, someone finds the room. Or is found by it," Luna said. On a narrow table beneath the cabinets lay 3 empty objects awaiting them. A small glass sphere, clear as ice, a silver stylus with no ink, and a strip of midnight ribbon. Seamus touched none of them. "We're meant to leave something, aren't we? Eventually." Luna's gaze had gone to the nearest crystal bowl, where the shining dust had begun to stir more quickly. "But first, we're meant to receive." As she spoke, the bowl tipped of its own accord, not spilling, only leaning until its light slid over the central glass. The surface rippled. A scent touched the air-cold stone. Peat smoke, damp wool, and the room changed around them without changing at all. One moment they stood in the chamber of bowls and cabinets. The next, they were also elsewhere. Not inside a pensieve, not falling, not submerged. More like standing at the edge of another person's night, as gently as one might stand at the edge of a lake. Before them lay Hogwarts nearly 900 years younger. Its towers were fewer, its walls sharper. Torches burned in iron brackets instead of enclosed lamps. On a flat rooftop stood a thin Ravenclaw girl wrapped in dark blue, her braids tied back with leather cord. Around her, the stars moved in patterns just as deliberate as tonight's, though the shapes they made belonged to a different age: crown, ship, wheel, sheaf, sword. The girl watched with the deep, still attention of someone who already suspected that noticing was a form of duty. The scene lasted only long enough to feel its weather, the bite of ancient wind, the rough weave of old wool, the hush of a castle not yet used to its own size. Then the chamber returned around them, and another bowl brightened. This second witness was a Hufflepuff boy in the 1400s, kneeling in a herb garden lit by winter stars, mapping patterns with sprigs of rosemary laid carefully on the soil. The next was a Slytherin prefect walking the covered bridge in rain, while constellations shifted behind clouds bright as pearl. Then a witch from the 1700s, sitting on the floor of a bell tower, coat around her shoulders, recording the sky, not with diagrams, but with little scraps of verse, because As the silver caption on the bowl later informed them, she had disliked mathematics, but loved exactness. One by one, the chamber offered them not full lives, only precise and intimate slices of attention. How each person had stood, what they had smelled in the air, what part of the castle had held them, what small feeling had risen when the heavens above decided, briefly, and for reasons never fully explained, to become legible. The room did not overwhelm them with importance. That was its genius. It made the long continuity of Hogwarts feel not grand, but inhabited. Century after century, someone had looked up, someone had cared, someone had left a trace for the next awake and wondering soul. At last, the brightest bowl of all turned toward them. On its plaque, there was no old date, only tonight. The final bowl did not immediately pour its light into the black glass. It hovered above the center of the orrery and shone with a patient expectancy, as though waiting for permission no one had yet thought to give. Luna stepped closer, in the shifting silver reflected on her face. She looked for a moment as if she belonged equally to tower and sky. "I think," she said, "it is waiting for us to understand that memory is part of the event, not a souvenir afterward." Dean considered that, so if we want to keep tonight, we have to keep it while we're still inside it. Exactly. Seamus drew the silver stylus from the table. It felt surprisingly warm. At one end was a narrow crystal bead, clear as dew. No instruction accompanied it. None was needed. The room, the stars, and the bowls together had already taught the rule. What mattered here was not performance, only honest attention. Luna took the stylus first. She touched the crystal end to her temple. At once a thread of silver light drew free, not painful, not even strange after the first second, simply intimate. It carried with it the feel of the Ravenclaw window, the sight of stars rearranging themselves, the sound of Dean's quiet intake of breath on the tower roof, the precise texture of the moment when she had realized the sky was not merely being beautiful, but purposeful. She wound the thread into the waiting glass sphere. It settled there as a tiny swirl of radiance. Dean followed. His memory entered with different colors altogether. The artist's shock of lines breaking and reforming, the silhouettes of telescopes under silver light, the urge to sketch faster than the sky could change, the astonishment of seeing old witnesses rendered not as names in history, but as fellow observers under the same immense dark. When his silver thread joined Luna's in the sphere, the light within broadened and began rotating with delicate slowness. Seamus went last. He frowned in concentration, as if uncertain what part of the night most deserved preserving, and perhaps that uncertainty itself became part of what the room took from him. His thread shone warmer than the others. In it lay the surprising comfort of being included in something he had not expected to understand, the practical satisfaction of following a clue correctly, the half-hidden tenderness of carrying toast into wonder and being met there without ridicule. When his memory settled beside the others, the sphere glimmered like a small moon cupped in glass. The empty bowl above the orrery lowered itself. Luna placed the sphere inside. At once all 7 bowls brightened together. Light ran through the brass arms and into the floor, where thin silver lines awakened between the stones in patterns that mirrored the stars overhead. The cabinets along the walls shone softly. The old ribbon in one case fluttered, although no air stirred. Several of the stored objects glowed faintly in answer, as if each remembered its own night and offered silent welcome to the newest one, joining the chain. Across the black glass in the center appeared not words this time, but an image. 3 figures standing on a tower beneath a changing sky. Their outlines were simple and unmistakable. One held a notebook. One carried toast. One looked upward, as though she had been expected all along. Dean smiled first. "That's us, for now," said Luna gently. "Later it will simply be 3 people some other students are grateful to meet." The room seemed to approve that answer. The image broadened. Around their 3 silver figures, others appeared faintly in a ring. The rooftop observer from the 12th century, the herb garden boy, the bell tower poet, and more besides, all linked not by blood or house or era, but by the calm accident of having looked up on the right night. Seamus let out a breath he had been holding. "It's a bit odd," he said, "to think we've become part of a tradition no one talks about." "Many of the best traditions are like that," said Luna. "They do not need crowds in order to continue, beyond the domed ceiling of the chamber." The real sky was beginning to pale very slightly at the eastern edge. Not dawn yet, only the earliest loosening of night. The stars above the castle still held their uncommon order, but there was a quiet sense of completion in them now, as though the conversation had reached a restful point. The central glass darkened once more, and silver writing appeared in one final line. "When the next listening night returns, let this be enough to guide whoever is wakeful." Then the bowls dimmed to their former slow glow. The chamber returned to stillness. No applause, no trumpet of magic, simply the sense that something had been properly placed where it belonged. Luna wound the midnight ribbon around the base of the empty stylus and set both back on the table. Dean closed his sketchbook, though he knew no drawing would ever fully catch what the sky had done. Seamus, after a moment's debate with himself, removed the toast from his pocket and placed the napkin beside the nearest cabinet. "For completeness," he said. Luna laughed softly, and because the room had already proven itself more gracious than solemn, the napkin folded itself into a neat square of silver-threaded cloth and vanished into one of the drawers. "That's rather kind of it," Dean observed. "It understands contributions of all levels," said Luna. When they left, the constellation door closed behind them without haste. The corridor beyond was unchanged, and yet the ordinary torch brackets and tapestries looked touched by a finer patience than before. The castle had not shown them a secret so much as included them in one. That was different, kinder. They walked back through the sleeping halls, while the first delicate hints of morning began gathering beyond the windows. At the stair landing where their paths would part, they paused, unwilling to disturb the hush with too much speech. "I'll never look at the astronomy tower the same way again," Dean said. "Nor at toast," said Seamus. Luna's smile was full of silver quiet. "That is how one knows a night has been useful." They separated there, each carrying no visible token, and yet feeling accompanied. Behind shutters and under canopies, the school slept on, unaware that another thread had just been added to one of its oldest, unseen weavings. High above, the last strange brightness of the stars softened toward dawn, and Hogwarts, satisfied for. Now, let the night settle back into its ordinary miracles. By the next afternoon, the sky had changed its mood entirely. By the next afternoon, rain had arrived with complete conviction. It tapped at the high windows, then drew silver lines down the glass, then settled into a steady rhythm that wrapped Gryffindor Tower in weather. The common room answered as it always did. The fire was built high, damp cloaks appeared on pegs and chairbacks, steam rose from mugs of cider and tea. Outside dissolved into gray lawns and blurred trees. Inside, every warm color deepened. Rainy afternoons changed the house. Students who might have scattered across the grounds stayed gathered near the hearth. Homework was attempted with less conviction and abandoned with less guilt. Someone always ended up on the rug with a half-finished game. Someone else described food until half the room longed for the kitchens. The whole tower felt less like a dormitory and more like a ship content to be at sea. Fred and George Weasley, who considered mild boredom a condition fit for immediate treatment, chose that weather for the unveiling of a new invention. They carried a brass-bound case to the middle of the room and set it down with such solemn care that half the common room smiled before the lid was even open. "Cruelly," George agreed. confined by rain, bereft of variety, fortunately, said Fred. We are men of action. Inside the case lay 3 things. A folded carpet patterned like a wandering map, a brass weather vane, no taller than a candlestick, and a tin full of glowing paper circles that shifted color when the firelight caught them. The carpet spread itself over the stones until much of the floor was covered in stitched rivers, tiny mountains, winding footpaths, and pale fields. George set the weather vane in the middle and tapped it once with his wand. The arrow spun, slowed, and pointed west. Then Fred tossed the paper circles upward, and they hovered above the carpet like quiet little moons. And because it was impossible for the twins to leave well enough alone, those expeditions would also include sweets, competition, and a very small amount of highly dignified nonsense. The first journey arrived as a shimmer over the carpet. A hillside path appeared after rain, chairs becoming boulders, stools becoming mossy stumps, and the floor seeming to slope toward a clouded horizon. Tiny golden moths rose from the edge of the carpet, each carrying a soft point of light in its wing. The task was not to catch the moths, but to guide them by calm hand movements toward matching markers before they settled in the wrong place. This proved harder and much funnier than anyone expected. The moths adored sleeves, mistrusted frantic waving, and seemed to regard Ron's enthusiasm as a sort of weather system. Neville had a natural gift for coaxing them. Harry anticipated their turns as if they were very small snitches. Hermione ended up with 3 glowing creatures in her hair and bore the indignity with admirable restraint. Clara, by simply holding out both hands and walking backward very slowly, brought a whole trio home at once. They were no larger than thumbs and carried soft points of light in their wing. The task was not to catch them, but to guide them by hand motions only toward matching markers before they settled in the wrong place. This proved harder and funnier than anyone expected. The moths adored sleeves, ignored frantic waving, and seemed to think Ron's enthusiasm was a kind of weather. Neville, to no one's surprise except perhaps his own, excelled at coaxing them. Harry predicted their turns, as if they were very small snitches. Hermione acquired 3 in her hair and wore them there with increasing resignation. Clara, by simply holding out both hands and walking backward very slowly, guided a trio of silver moths home and earned the first warm amber token of the afternoon. For the second journey, the weather vane swung east and the hillside thinned into a harbor at night. Tables and chairs seemed to stand on dark piers above imagined water where lantern reflections trembled. Narrow bridges of light connected one island of furniture to another, and each team was given a bowl of glass stars. Their task was to carry the stars across the shifting bridges and place them so the paths stayed bright and steady. If the colors crowded together, the bridges dimmed. If they were set too far apart, the enchantment wandered toward absurd destinations, once including Trevor the Toad and once, to Ron's lasting irritation, his own slipper. This round made everyone cooperative in the most charming way. Dean saw patterns before anyone else. Seamus narrated the work with unnecessary grandeur. Hermione found the cleanest routes and then watched, in a silence that said everything, as the rest ignored her until her routes proved exactly right. Ginny crossed the bridges with easy balance. Neville managed to carry a bowl of stars in one hand while keeping one eye on his seedlings, and somehow did both with complete success. The bridges faded, the paper circles widened into small hanging windows, and inside, each one lived a different weather. Snowfall through dark pines, fog over the lake, summer rain on greenhouse glass, pale sunlight returning after a storm. Beneath them, the common room looked more like itself again, which made the magic gentler rather than less enchanting. For the last round, there would be no racing at all. Each little group simply had to choose one weather window. and build beneath it the coziest possible answer to that small world, using whatever the room already held close at hand. Blankets, lamps, shawls, books, biscuits, tea trays, cushions, and the patient intelligence of people who know what comfort looks like. The room responded beautifully to that idea. Under the snowfall window, a cluster of second-year's meadow, a blanket nest, and dimmed a lamp to icy blue. Beneath summer rain, Ginny, Clara, and two other girls arranged cushions, adventure books, and a kettle, humming softly on a side table. Harry, Ron, and Hermione chose the fog window, and made there a nook of tea. Borrowed cardigans and 3 low lamps placed so carefully that the whole corner looked like a thought one could sit inside. Neville set his seedlings beneath the sunlight after storm window and charmed the faintest mist above their leaves until they shone fresh as morning. No one truly won that round. Even the scoreboard seemed to understand. After a thoughtful pause, it released a drift of small golden commas over the room instead of numbers, and Gryffindor cheered with the contentment of a house that had discovered it preferred coziness to victory once the weather turned. Prizes were distributed anyway, because the twins considered sweets not a luxury, but an ethical obligation. By then, the trading had already begun, and half the room insisted Clara deserved something extra on account of the moths. She chose a honey-colored sweet, and looked so openly pleased by it that Ginny gave her 2 more without needing to explain why. When the enchantments faded, the carpet folded itself. The weather windows grew thin and vanished, and the little vane bowed once toward the fire before going still. The rain still sounded at the glass. The embers still glowed, yet the common room now held that especially soothing happiness that comes after shared play, when laughter has spent itself into warmth, and nobody feels in any hurry to go elsewhere. By dusk, the storm had gentled. A few stars tried bravely between the clouds. Students settled into chairs and corners with sweets, books, games, and sleepy conversation. The tower drew itself inward around them, content and glowing, while outside the wet world darkened into evening once more. Night gathered once more around the castle. The windows darkened into mirrors. The last conversation softened. One by one, books closed, mugs emptied, and the bright edges of the day dissolved into embers and lamp glow. Hogwarts did not feel finished. It never did. Somewhere a portrait was still awake. Somewhere, another small kindness was waiting for the right quiet hour. For now, though, the fire was enough. May the embers burn low. May the rain soften. May the halls of Hogwarts remain wide and kind in the dark, with just enough wonder left awake to follow into dreams, and just enough still hidden for another night.